The perimeter sensors chirped their endless rhythm as Sergeant Luke Grayson completed his hourly check of the bunker's defensive grid. Each ping represented another 30 meters of secure ground, or what passed for secure on Pollis-14. Through the reinforced viewports, he could see the aurora dancing above the battlefield, casting sickly green light across the frozen corpses and wreckage that had become permanent features of the landscape. Grid 7's losing power again. Corporal Jane Hartfield called from her workstation, her breath visible in the cold air, despite the bunker's heating systems running at full capacity. Third time this week. The cold's eating through the insulation faster than I can patch it. Grayson nodded, marking another item on his growing list of equipment failures. How long? Maybe 2 hours before we lose that sector completely. Hartfield's fingers flew across her diagnostic panel, the screen's glow highlighting the dark circles under her eyes. I can reroute power from the secondary systems, but that'll leave us blind if the main generator fails. From her position at the observation post, Private First Class Maya Williams lowered her thermal scope. Movement in Sector 5. 3 signatures, probably another probe. Her voice carried the flat effect of someone who'd called out similar warnings dozens of times before. They're using the wreckage of that downed transport for cover. Again. They're getting bolder, Grayson muttered, moving to the weapons station. Through the viewport, he could make out the transport. She mentioned a coalition dropship that had been shot down 2 months ago. Its hull had become part of the permanent landscape, just another piece of metal frozen into the endless ice fields of Pollis-14. The bunker's interior lights flickered, and a gust of wind howled through a microscopic crack in the eastern wall. The sound reminded Grayson of the screams he'd heard during the last major assault, when an entire company had been caught in a sudden storm. They'd found the bodies 3 days later, frozen solid in their combat poses. Storm front approaching from the north, Williams reported, switching to atmospheric scanning. Big one, bigger than last week's. Hartfield swore under her breath. That's all we need. The grid barely held during the last one. Grayson moved to the command console, pulling up the long-range weather data. The storm looked massive, a swirling vortex of purple and red on the thermal imaging. They had maybe 6 hours before it hit. 6 hours to shore up their defenses and prepare for whatever the enemy might try under its cover. Hartfield, prioritize Grid 7. Williams, maintain watch on Sector 5, but start running hourly checks on the emergency generators. If this storm's as bad as it looks, we'll need them. He paused, watching as his breath frosted in front of him. Command's been quiet for 3 days now. Interference from the aurora's getting worse, Hartfield said, though they all knew it was more than that. The silence from command had been growing longer, the gaps in communication wider. Either the brass had bigger problems elsewhere, or they'd written off this section of the front as a lost cause. The perimeter sensors chirped again, but this time in a different pattern. Williams was back at her scope in an instant. Multiple contacts, Sector 3 through 6. They're using the storm's approach for cover. Numbers. At least a platoon. Maybe more behind the ridgeline. She adjusted her scope. They're carrying heavy gear. This isn't another probe. Grayson felt the familiar weight of command settle onto his shoulders. They'd held this position for 3 months, watching as the war ground to a frozen stalemate around them. They'd lost good people, buried them in graves cut into the ice, and kept fighting because those were their orders. Battle stations, he ordered, his voice carrying the authority that had kept them alive this long. Hartfield, get those grids online, whatever it takes. Williams, I want targeting solutions for every approach vector. As his squad moved with practiced efficiency, Grayson allowed himself one moment to close his eyes. When he opened them, the aurora was still dancing overhead, casting its cold light over another battle about to begin on this frozen hell of a world. The perimeter sensors continued their endless chirping, counting down the seconds until the enemy reached their lines. Above them, the storm approached like a hungry predator, promising to devour them all, friend and foe alike. Just another day on Pollis-14. The storm hit like a hammer against the bunker's walls. 3 hours had passed since the enemy's failed assault, and now they could barely see 5 meters beyond their positions. The winds howled at 200 kilometers per hour, hurling ice crystals that cut like microscopic razors through anything left exposed. "That's it for Grid 7," Hartfield announced, her voice tight with frustration. She yanked her hands back from the sparking control panel, shaking them against the cold. "The whole sector's dead. We're running on emergency power now." Grayson stood at the main viewport, though there was nothing to see but swirling white darkness. The enemy attack had been repelled, but at a cost. Their ammunition reserves were down to 60%, and the eastern barrier had taken damage from a plasma charge. Status on life support. 8 hours at current capacity. Hartfield wiped frost from her screen. "Maybe 12 if we seal off the lower level and crowd up here." From her position, Williams maintained her watch, though the sophisticated targeting systems had been reduced to basic motion detection. The cold's affecting the motion sensors, getting ghost readings every few minutes. She adjusted her layers of thermal gear. "But I don't think anything's moving out there, not in this." The bunker groaned under another assault from the wind. Ice was forming inside now, creeping across the metal in elaborate patterns. Their breath hung in clouds before their faces, the environmental systems struggling to maintain even basic life support. "Comms are completely down," Hartfield reported, moving to another station. "The antenna array is probably sheeted in ice. We're deaf and blind out here." Grayson checked his tactical display, now operating on backup power. The storm covered an area of 200 square kilometers. Somewhere out there, the enemy forces were likely huddled in their own shelters, equally blind and frozen. The thought brought him no comfort. Sir Williams called out, her voice different now. "I'm picking up something. It's faint, but it sounds like a distress beacon." They gathered around her station, listening to the weak signal cutting through the storm static. 3 short pulses, 3 long, a universal distress code. "Coalition frequency," Hartfield confirmed, running the signal through her analyzer. "Can't be more than half a kilometer out." Grayson felt the weight of command pressing down harder than ever. Someone was out there, probably survivors from the earlier assault, now trapped in the worst storm they'd seen since arriving on Pollis-14. Standard protocol was clear: maintain position, protect the strategic assets. How long would they last out there, he asked, though he already knew the answer. In this, Hartfield glanced at her environmental readings. Maybe an hour. The temperatures dropped another 15 degrees since the storm hit. Williams hadn't taken her eyes off the signal display. "Sir, I can triangulate their position. They're in the wreckage field, probably using one of the downed vessels for shelter." The wreckage field, a graveyard of ships and vehicles from 3 months of constant warfare. It offered some protection from the wind, but it was also a maze of twisted metal and unstable ice formations. A death trap in these conditions. "We can't risk it," Hartfield said, voicing the practical concern. "Our systems are barely holding together as it is. Opening the blast doors even once in these conditions." She didn't need to finish. They all knew what was at stake. The integrity of their shelter was the only thing keeping them alive. Grayson moved to the equipment locker, pulling out the heavy weather gear. "Williams, get me those coordinates. Hartfield, prepare for emergency deployment. Minimal time with the doors open." Sir, both women spoke simultaneously. "We didn't come to this frozen hell to let good soldiers die in the cold." He began suiting up, checking the seals on the thermal gear. "Williams, you're with me. Hartfield, hold this position. If we're not back in 30 minutes, seal the bunker and contact command when the storm passes." Williams was already moving to get her gear, but Hartfield stepped forward. "The regulations would have us maintain our position at all costs," Grayson finished, securing his face mask. "But there won't be much of a position left to defend if we lose power completely. Might as well do some good before that happens." The next few minutes were a flurry of preparation. Extra power cells, emergency beacons, guidelines to prevent separation in the whiteout conditions. Every piece of equipment they could spare that might make the difference between life and death out there. As they prepared to open the blast doors, Grayson caught Hartfield's eye. "If anything happens, I'll hold this position," she promised. "As long as there's power to keep the lights on." The blast doors opened with a groan of protest, and the storm rushed in like a living thing, hungry for warmth. Grayson and Williams stepped out into the maelstrom, the guideline between them their only connection to safety. Behind them, the doors sealed with a final, heavy clang. Ahead, somewhere in the howling white darkness, a distress beacon continued its lonely pulse. The long night of Pollis-14 had only just begun. The wreckage field emerged from the white void like a graveyard of metal giants. Grayson and Williams moved carefully between the frozen hulks, their helmet lights barely penetrating the storm's fury. 20 minutes had passed since they'd left the bunker, each second measured in the decreasing temperature readings on their suit displays. Signals stronger Williams shouted over the howling wind. 10 meters ahead, bearing 230. They found the survivors huddled in the broken cockpit of a downed gunship, 3 coalition soldiers, their combat armor crusted with ice. 2 were unconscious, the third barely maintaining the distress beacon. All would have been dead within the hour. The return journey was worse. Dragging 3 immobile soldiers through the storm pushed their suits' heating systems to the breaking point. Twice they lost sight of their guideline in the whiteout, and only Williams' exceptional spatial awareness got them back on track. When the bunker's exterior lights finally pierced the darkness, Grayson's suit was reporting critical power levels. The blast doors opened like a miracle, spilling warm light into the storm. Inside, Move Hartfield helped drag the survivors in, the doors sealing behind them with a sound like a thunderclap. "You cut that close, sir. Another 5 minutes and I'd have had to." The bunker's lights went out. Emergency red lighting kicked in, casting everything in a bloody glow. Hartfield was already moving to her station. Main power's gone. The core temperature dropped too low while the doors were cycling. "We're on auxiliary power only." "How long?" Grayson asked, helping Williams remove her frozen gear. "Maybe an hour." The generators weren't designed for this kind of cold. She looked at the survivors they'd brought in. "Medical supplies are in the lower level. But if we power up the lifts..." "We go down on foot," Grayson ordered. "Save every watt we can." The next hour passed in a blur of desperate activity. They moved the survivors to the lower level where the ambient temperature was slightly higher. Williams worked to treat their injuries, while Hartfield tried everything she could think of to restore power to the dying bunker. Grayson stood at the viewport, watching ice crawl across the reinforced plastic like living frost. The storm showed no signs of weakening. If anything, it was getting stronger. Sir Hartfield's voice was quiet. "I think I found something. In the engineering logs." She showed him the data on her tablet. The bunker's original designers had included a last resort protocol, a way to tap into the geothermal vents deep beneath the ice. It would provide enough power to survive the storm, but the process would destabilize the entire area. The defensive position would be compromised, Grayson said, understanding the implications. The whole sector would become unstable. "We'd be abandoning our post, sir." The bunker creaked ominously as another wave of wind struck it. In the dim red light, Grayson looked at his people, Hartfield still working despite exhaustion, Williams tending to the survivors they'd risked everything to save. Good soldiers, all of them. They deserved better than freezing to death on this godforsaken rock. "Do it," he ordered. "Initiate the protocol." The next few hours were a symphony of groaning ice and desperate preparations. The geothermal tap sent tremors through the ice shelf, creating new crevasses and shifting the frozen battlefield above. They packed essential supplies, prepared the survivors for transport, and waited for their window. When the storm finally began to weaken, they could see how dramatically the landscape had changed. The ice shelf was breaking apart, creating a new maze of chasms and unstable ground. Their defensive position, held for so many months at such cost, was now impossible to maintain. "Command's going to love this," Williams said as they prepared to evacuate. The survivors were conscious now, being helped into emergency transport gear. "Command hasn't been out here," Grayson replied, checking the rescue beacon's signal strength. "They haven't seen what this place does to people, what it makes us choose between." The first rescue ships were already on their way, diverted from other sectors by the massive geological disturbance their desperate solution had caused. The war for Pollis-14 would continue elsewhere, but this sector would be forever changed. As they prepared to leave their ruined bunker, Grayson took one last look through the viewport. The aurora still danced overhead, indifferent to the human dramas played out beneath its light. Somewhere out there, enemy soldiers were likely facing the same choices: duty or survival, orders or humanity. "Ready to move," Sir Hartfield reported, her tablet showing the increasingly unstable ground readings. Grayson nodded. They'd held the line until nature itself had forced their hand. Sometimes, he realized, the bravest thing a soldier could do was know when to let go. "Move out," he ordered, and they began their final exodus from the bunker that had been their home and prison for so long. Above them, the storm on Pollis-14 finally began to clear, revealing a battlefield transformed not by war, but by the simple, unstoppable force of survival. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I hope you loved it. Please remember to subscribe if you did like it so you can see more videos like this. And please give us a like and a comment too. I'll see you in the next one.